I want to begin this morning by saying Happy Father's Day to the fathers in our assembly. Your role in the society in which we live the importance of it has never been more evident than it is in our day. And although I'm not preaching a Father's Day sermon this morning, I do want to take the opportunity to encourage you to continue to represent fatherhood well to the influence of those in your sphere of influence. In our study of the parables, last week, I believe, we noted, maybe the first week, that Jesus had taught upwards of 35 parables. Not an exact number because we stated that there is some ambiguity on what constitutes a parable among some who calculate or try to number them versus others. Some of his teaching may just be a simile or a metaphor rather than a parable of sorts. So upwards of 35 that at least get that designation. In our study through the parables this quarter, if I counted accurately, we're only looking at somewhere around 20 of those, maybe 22. So there are some others that are, genuinely parables in every sense that we'll not look at as part of our Bible class curriculum. So I hope to use some of them in sermons so that we get a more full representation of the parables that he taught. And this morning, I would like to do that from Luke chapter 16, the parable that is commonly called the parable of the unjust steward. The first part of which was read for us by Charlie. This particular parable was spoken directly to the disciples of Jesus, but as was often the case, there were others in earshot of the things that he was teaching. And so these things were heard by sinners. They were heard by the scribes. They were heard by the Pharisees of various and diverse audience within the hearing range of Jesus on this occasion. If you look at the text, and if you look at the broader context of the things right before the parable and right after the parable, there are some statements made about what Jesus was teaching that are relative to the parable that is under our consideration. You might recall Luke purposed to write an orderly account of the things that Jesus had done. And there's an order to the things that he is teaching here. Just kind of notice with me briefly as we lay the foundation for this study this morning that in chapter 15, verse 1, we see that tax collectors and sinners drew near to him to hear him. The parable that comes next, you have the parable of the lost sheep, you have the parable of the lost coin, and then you have the parable of the lost son. And one of the beginning characters in that parable of the lost son, notice, is one who says, "Give me the portion of goods that falls to me." So the father divides to him his livelihood. That son journeyed to a far country and wasted the possessions with prodigal living. And then verse 14, he began to be in want. So we have this desire for riches, this desire for resources, and those things end up being squandered before we get into the parable that we're looking at this morning. And then if you look at verse 14 of Luke 16, what will be on the heels of the parable, now the Pharisees who were lovers of money also heard these things, and they derided him. And then when you drop down to verse 19, the next narrative, the account of the rich man and Lazarus, begins with, there is a certain rich man. And then we get the account of the rich man who squandered opportunity, wealth, and resources to his own detriment. So you have that environment of riches, wealth, resources that are squandered, that aren't used correctly. And then right in the middle of that, you have the parable of the unjust steward. So I'd like for us to study that parable in that context this morning and see what we can learn from it. Let's back up again and look at verses 1 through 8 and get a sense of the central figure of the parable. Read along with me again. He said to his disciples, there was a certain rich man who had a steward. And the accusation was brought to him that this man was wasting his goods. So he called him and said to him, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your stewardship, for you can no longer be steward. Then the steward said within himself, what shall I do? For my master is taking the stewardship away from me. I cannot dig. I'm ashamed to beg. I have resolved what to do, that when I am put out of the stewardship, then they may receive me into their houses. So he called one of his master's debtors, notice his master's debtors, to him, and said to the first, how much do you owe my master? He said, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, take your bill, sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, how much do you owe? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said, take your bill and write 80. So the master commended the unjust steward because he had dealt shrewdly. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. And I say unto you, make friends for yourselves by unrighteous mammon, that when you fail, they may receive you into an everlasting home. All right, the central figure of the parable here is this steward. A steward is a person who is put in charge of wealth or resources that aren't their own. They are given charge of these things, and they are expected to give a return on that investment to the one who put them in the stewardship. There are a couple of passages that come to mind relative to stewardship. Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 2, making a general observation, moreover, it is required in stewards that a man be found faithful. So if someone entrusts you to a stewardship, they have in mind that you're going to be faithful to what has been given to you, and they're going to benefit from the labor that you do in that stewardship. In Titus chapter 1 and verse 7, elders are stewards of God. Well, what does that mean? Well, they have been put by God into the stewardship primarily of souls. The souls in the local congregation under their charge. And the work of that local congregation as well. And God expects them to be fruitful in their stewardship, to give him a return on his investment. If he has given 100 souls to their charge, then he expects at least 100 soul return on that. That's why Hebrews chapter 13 tells us that we're to submit to them and to not make their work grievous, because they watch for our souls and they'll give an account. In other words, stewards give an account for what has been put under their charge. But this steward has been reported by others who know what he's doing to be a failure in his stewardship. He's not doing the work that he's supposed to be doing right. In Matthew chapter 25, with respect to the talents, individuals were given a stewardship over things that were commensurate with their ability to give a return. Some do good with that, some don't. And the master holds accountable those who have been put in such a stewardship. Some were told, well done. Some were called wicked servants because they had failed as stewards. This steward is one who falls into the category of failure. He failed to give the expected return on the investment that was made in him. And so he's going to be put out of the stewardship. Well, what is this man who says he can't work? We're not told why he can't work, but he can't work. He can't earn. He's too proud to beg. He's not going to go and beg. It's unlikely that this man was doing all of the work. He was supposed to be supervising the work that was being done, but he wasn't doing that work well. He was a failure in that regard. And now he says, I can't go do the work. I can't beg. I'm ashamed to beg. So what am I going to do? How am I going to get out of this predicament? Well, in an act of desperation, with an evident immediacy, he comes up with a plan. He's going to go to those who owe his master money. He's going to provide some relief to them in what they owe so he can get an immediate payment on that. And he's, at least accomplished something before he's put out of this stewardship. And so he's relieved, in some respects, a staggering debt that was owed to his master. And so, in some sense, he's defrauded his master because his master doesn't get everything that he should have gotten from those who owed him money. But the feedback from the Lord or the master of this steward is probably not what would be expected. One would expect condemnation, a judgment, a disapproval of his action. But notice in verse 8, the master commended the unjust or the unrighteous steward. Why? Because he dealt shrewdly. And so the feedback from the Lord of the steward actually is commendation for what he has done. Now, that may be one of the reasons we don't study this parable very much, is because that's kind of perplexing. Here we have a situation where someone does something on the surface that looks not right. It looks unjust. It looks like bad behavior, and yet Jesus takes that behavior, and at least one characteristic of it, he highlights and gives approval of that behavior as something worthy of emulation. So let's take a moment now and look at the challenges in this parable and get the sense of what Jesus is actually commending, lest we get the mindset that Jesus is approving of this shrewd, even unjust and unrighteous behavior. The challenges of the parable are revealed to us in the latter part of verse 8 and into verse 9. So look at that again. He says, for the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. We have a contrast here between two groups of people. We have the sons of this world, that would be unrighteous people who are not connected with God. In our day, it would be non-Christians. And you have the sons of light, those who are pursuing God's will, those who have an association with God today, Christians. Two different groups of people. And yet, Jesus says that former group, the sons of this generation or this world, are more shrewd with their generation than the sons of light, than Christians are. And that's kind of a head scratcher, that Jesus would commend an unjust man when he compares him to people who are Christians or godly people. This is an illustration or an example, I'll say, of something that our teachers are warning us about in these classes this quarter, about not trying to assign meaning to every detail of the parable. Because if you do that, you might walk away and say, well, the ends justify the means. It doesn't really matter how you get to where you're supposed to be as long as you get there. And that's not the case. You can see this in some other parables in Luke chapter 18, verses 1 through 8, with the unjust judge. There was a judge, you remember, the woman came to him and begged him over and over and over repeatedly to give her relief from her adversary. And the Bible describes him as an unjust judge, one who did not fear God, and points out that judge eventually, because of that woman's persistence, gives in and does what she's asking. Well, if you're not careful, you could conclude that Jesus is commending this unjust judge and giving approval to a man who doesn't fear God or regard the king. That would be going overboard and assigning meaning to the details of the earthly aspect of the parable. He's pointing out the persistence of the woman and how it paid off in getting what she wanted. He's not giving condemnation to an unjust or an ungodly judge. In Matthew chapter 24, verses 43 through 44, Jesus describes his coming as a thief in the night, that he'll come as a thief in the night. Well, he's not sanctioning the behavior of a thief in the night, a thief. He's using a behavior or characteristic of a thief who comes suddenly, unexpectedly, to describe what the judgment will be like. Don't go overboard in trying to do a one-for-one match in the details of parables to spiritual meaning or implication, lest you develop the mindset that Jesus was okay with the behavior of this man, everything about it, that he robbed his master in order to take care of himself. That's not part of the condemnation. The shrewdness or the commendation is in the urgency and the way that this man took his situation seriously and did something about it. And we'll talk more about that as we go. But just get the point that it was his prudent dealing with his situation that won the Lord's approval. The Lord's debtors are now his. And he has done something to preserve himself with an eye toward the future. Okay. The sons of this world are more prudent than the sons of light. How is that even possible, that anything worldly people do could be a better demonstration of behavior than what the sons of light do? How could there be any comparison in that regard? How's that even possible? I've talked before about my law enforcement days, how genius criminals can be. And some of the ingenuity that they come up with in order to get what they want. I mean, and it's been said, if they would put all that brain power to good use, just think of the benefit that would come from it. But you just think about it, when you listen or you hear news or you hear about a situation of unjust behavior, illegal behavior, how shrewd and how prudent and how genius, really, people can be in this world to accomplish things that are purely worldly in nature and have no spiritual value or benefit to them. That's the situation with this man. He's been unjust in his dealing with his stewardship, but the way he fixes it represents ingenuity. It represents shrewdness. It represents a prudence and a forethought and a mind toward preserving his future. And Jesus says that kind of behavior that is so often seen in the world is often missing in the lives, the behavior, and the conduct of children of light, of godly people, of Christians. And so that can sting a little bit. One commentary that, actually it was a lectureship book on the parables. There was a chapter in it on this particular parable, written by a gospel preacher by the name of Virgil Hale. And he made this statement. He said, how true this is. We who are children of God, children of light, do not use as much wisdom in obtaining what we desire, a home in heaven, as children of the world use in getting what they want, the things that merely pertain to this life. They use far more wisdom in the physical realm than we do so often in the spiritual realm. Notice again back at verse 9, he says, I say to you, make friends for yourselves by unrighteous mammon, that when you fail, they may receive you into an everlasting home. What is unrighteous mammon? Well, mammon is a word used in the Bible a couple of times, maybe 3, to describe riches, resources, and means. Things really that pertain to this world that are used, can be used either for good or for bad. Most often, they're used for bad. And they're viewed, in principle at least, as unrighteous in that regard because they are often used in a way that doesn't have any spiritual benefit or connotation. Riches actually are amoral, though. They're neither good nor bad, and they can be used to our benefit spiritually. They can be used to advance spiritual purposes. They can be used to execute God's plan and purpose to evangelize the world. They can be used to accomplish good. A couple of passages here, 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 9 and 10. Says, those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and snare and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money, notice it doesn't say for money is the root of all kinds of evil, but the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, from which some, having strayed from the faith in their greediness, they've pierced themselves through with many sorrows. In Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 20, Jesus said, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroys and where thieves break through and steal. Lay up rather for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break through and steal. And then back to 1 Timothy chapter 6, listen to verses 17 and 19. Command those who are rich in this present age not to be haughty, nor to trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God who gives us richly all things to enjoy. Let them rather do this, do good, that they be rich in good works, ready to give, willing to share, storing up for themselves a good foundation for the time to come, that they may lay hold on eternal life. Notice the Bible gives warning about the love of money and things. But it doesn't say, get rid of it, it's evil. Paul told Timothy to caution people about wealth, riches, and resources, but also to encourage them to use those things in a spiritually beneficial way. And so riches are amoral. They can be used for good or for bad. And so Jesus points that out, but then notice he says, make friends or make friendship or make favorable association for yourselves by unrighteous mammon, by means of riches, resources, and means. Why? That when you fail, they may receive you into an everlasting home. And so there's benefit, Jesus says, in association with what the text calls unrighteous mammon. again, in principle, because it's so often used in an evil way, but it has the capacity to be used in a way that's beneficial and prosperous. And he says here, in effect, that prudent action with these things prepares a lasting reception. Now, if you think about the steward in the parable, he had squandered those things. He had wasted his opportunity as steward. But when he was about to be put out of the stewardship, he made use of those things to prepare for his future. He created a relationship with these debtors to where they would be indebted to him after he was put out of the stewardship. They actually became his resources for his future, even though he had been ejected from that place of stewardship. And it's this prudent action, it's this foresight to the future that Jesus is highlighting. To not be thinking about right here in the immediate time and right now only, to be thinking about what you're going to do beyond this moment. And especially for us, from a spiritual perspective. Because passages like Revelation chapter 14 and verse 12 or 13 says, "Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord, that from now on, yes, says the Spirit, they may rest from their labors and their works do follow them." You see, if we live this life as unjust stewards and we make no preparation at all for our future, that's going to follow us. Other passages like Romans chapter 14 and or Matthew chapter 6 and verse 21. "For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." Again, we're not to lay up treasures on this earth. We're to have a mind for the future. What are we doing in preparation for tomorrow, for the future? What are we doing? Are we laying up treasures here? Are we squandering the opportunity of stewardship here? Or do we have the prudence, the shrewdness of this man and this example to look beyond the moment and to make preparations for what will come later? And so there's some challenges here in this parable. But the challenges go away really when we think about the specific characteristic or behavior that Jesus has in mind when he commends him. And it's that shrewdness that he demonstrated in looking toward his future. Now, what is this parable saying to us as Christians today? What was it saying to his disciples then, and what is it saying to us today? Let's finish verses 10 through 13. "And I say unto you, make friends for yourselves by unrighteous mammon, that when you fail, they may receive you into an everlasting home. He who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much. And he who is unjust in what is least is unjust also in much. Therefore, if you've not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, who will commit to you the trust of true riches? And if you have not been faithful in what is another man's, who will give to you your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon." Let me give us some points of observation here that bring this home, I think, in a practical way. First, this man saw that what he had was not really his. He was a steward of it. And when his accounting for that stewardship came before him, he realized that his stewardship was about to end. He was going to be put out. In that moment, he had a mind toward the future, and he used it while he had it to make lasting preparation. Now, we are stewards of God. We have resources at our availability that God expects us to give a return on. Our question for ourselves is, have we been faithful stewards, or would it be reported to God that we've been unjust and unfaithful in our stewardship. Incidentally, he doesn't need a whistleblower. He knows whether or not we're stewarding our resources well. We're to be prudent in that. We're not to be unjust. We're not to defraud people in order to advance our way. That's part of the parable, but that's not the point that Jesus was highlighting. What he is highlighting is prudence, resourcefulness, with a view toward our future and especially our eternal future. Romans chapter 14 and verse 12 says each one of us will give an account of himself toward God. We certainly will. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 10 says, we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that we may receive the things done in our body, whether good or bad. And so get this, we're stewards. We're to be prudent. We're to be resourceful with what God has put into our stewardship. What is that? Well, we have time, right? He's given us time, 24 hours in a day. Everybody has the same amount of time, but we don't all use that time the same. And we may not be using it in a way that demonstrates that we're stewards, that we recognize that what we have is not our own. We're going to be called into account for it. Our time may be taken away from us, and we may lose the opportunity to use it in preparation for the future. Realizing that now, we should use our time in view of our eternal future and destiny. We have talent, abilities that can be used and not squandered. We have means, whatever they are. Our places of employment sometimes can be means to advance our work as Christians. Again, not to defraud those that we work for, but we can use our means in this world for spiritual reasons, for spiritual purposes, to advance our spiritual future. Our influence can be used in meaningful ways. The Gospel Advocate Adult Bible Quarterly on this particular parable made this observation. People of this world are wiser in dealing with their opportunities than children of light are in dealing with ours. They capitalize on their chances to make money, achieve fame, get elected, and do great work, at least as far as the world is concerned. But often the people of God squander more opportunity than we use. And we have to evaluate that statement on an individual level. But if it's true that we're squandering the stewardship that we have, then we ought to learn from this parable of the importance of being prudent with what we have right now with a view toward the future. If we can't be resourceful with the little, if we can't be resourceful with mammon, then who's going to entrust to us the greater riches, Jesus says. That's the sense of this parable. It's not one that should be avoided because of some of the characteristics and details of it. It's one that should be embraced, that should be understood for the principle that Jesus highlights and commends here. And then we ought to look at our own lives and say, where do I fit in this picture? Do I think about my spiritual future and destiny? And do I realize that I'm in a stewardship now that has opportunities in it that helps me plan for and purpose for that? Not just for me, but for my family and for others in this world who are lost without direction. May God help us even today to learn the messages that are evident in these parables for our benefit. If you're here this morning, you're not a Christian, you need to obey the gospel. You have an opportunity, even right now, before you to hear the gospel and believe it, to turn away from sin, to repent, to confess your faith in Christ, to be baptized in water for the remission of your sins. Stewardship of time and opportunity is within your grasp, but don't be like the unjust steward and waste and squander that because your opportunity to prepare for the future might not be there when you look for it. We have to act urgently, and we have to use what we have right now in preparation for the future. Maybe as a Christian, or maybe as a non-Christian, someone who's never obeyed the gospel, you need to do that this morning. Maybe as a Christian, you've not been prudent in the use of your resources, in the use of mammon, to give it to spiritual benefit and to give God glory through it. I hope we've been encouraged in some way this morning to reflect on this parable and make changes where they're needed. And if your need is one of a public nature this morning, we're going to sing a song to encourage, an invitation, and you can come and we will help you in any way that we can as we stand and sing.